Good morning, everyone. My name is Elliot. I know most of you, and most of you know me, but I have been coming to Bellingham Covenant Church for a long time, I think since 2007, 2008. So I've been around, and I get the privilege of preaching occasionally. The last time I preached was in February, I think, during our Lenten series on the 7 last words from the cross. The nice thing about being a guest preacher is that you get to come and speak at the most interesting of times on the most interesting of topics. So I get to talk to you today about suffering on a holiday weekend. It's good to be here. Today we are continuing a series on 1 Peter, and we are looking at another passage on suffering. It's a theme that kind of runs throughout this book. Since Peter's original readers were suffering persecution for their faith, and scholars kind of disagree about how widespread this persecution was. They don't know necessarily whether it was government-sponsored persecution, or if it was just that they were suffering rejection from their neighbors or their professional communities. But regardless of the source, it does seem clear that the original readers of 1 Peter were suffering persecution for being Christians. And there are many places in the world today where Christians are being persecuted for their faith. They are suffering official government persecution. Thankfully, we live in a place where we don't have to worry about that. We do have the freedom to assemble and worship. And yet, we can learn a lot from what Peter says about the nature of suffering and how to handle it in general. Because our society doesn't tend to prepare us very well for suffering, but suffering is inevitable in this life. So when we do encounter it, unprepared as we so often are, it can utterly break us. We can learn from this passage, though, how to handle suffering so that we're not surprised by it, and so that we can come through it refined and not destroyed. So I've titled the sermon, Suffering Doesn't Have to Be Wasted, and I will have 3 major sections to it. The first is why suffering surprises us. And the second will be what's going on behind our suffering, and then the third is the possibility of finding joy in suffering. Okay, and the first one is on the screen, why suffering surprises us. So, until relatively recent times, suffering was much more a part of everyday life than it is today. Mortality was much higher. People would have many children, expecting some of them would not survive childhood. There are many more sicknesses that had no cures. If you got a toothache, unlike now where you can be at the dentist tomorrow, oftentimes you had to live with it for a very long time. Suffering was a much more common part of everyday life, and there were different ways of dealing with it. One of them that I want to point out is moralism, which is the belief that suffering is a sign that you had done something wrong. This is the solution or the explanation for suffering that is proposed by the friends of Job. If you're familiar with the book of Job in the Bible, Job suffers incredible losses of his family and all of his possessions, and he doesn't know why this has happened. He doesn't realize what he might have done to warrant it. And his friends come, and the best thing that they do is they sit with him for a long time. But then once they open their mouths, things go terribly wrong because they start to argue with Job and say, well, you must have done something to deserve all of this. And that is the approach to suffering that I would call moralism. And now a kind of maybe a more recent spin on moralism, at least in the West, is a belief in of karma, where you believe that people get what they deserve. The belief that people get what they deserve sometimes over several lifetimes, it sounds like a good way of understanding suffering when somebody does something bad to you, but when you flip it around and you start to suffer and you wonder what you did to deserve it, it becomes a much less appealing way to understand suffering, to deal with suffering. I remember many years ago, I was talking with a man who had, lived a very successful life professionally, and he was in the early stages of a disease that he knew would eventually end in his death. He didn't know how much longer he had, but he knew that it was a disease that would eventually kill him. And I remember having this conversation with him where he wondered aloud what he had done to deserve this disease. And I did my best to reassure him and to tell him that these things just happen. It's not something that you necessarily deserve. But he had lived his entire life as a moralist, and he had done very well for himself and felt like he deserved all the things that he had gotten until it got to a point where living life as a moralist, seeing suffering through the eyes of moralism, did not work for him anymore. And all of us, at some point, I think, get to that point. And either moralism or ignoring suffering altogether is a possibility for us, or it's an attractive option for us in the modern West, because we can avoid suffering more than in any previous society in history. Because of this, sometimes we can feel like we are owed a prosperous life. There was an orthopedic surgeon named Paul Brand. I don't know if you have ever heard of him, but he was, as I mentioned, an orthopedic surgeon who is well known for his work on leprosy patients. He was the first person to understand leprosy as a nerve disease rather than a tissue disease. And he recognized that what leprosy did to people was it made them unable to feel pain. And that led them to do things like, touch a hot stove and not realize that it was burning them. And he eventually, so the first part of his career he spent in India, working with leprosy patients, and the second part of his career he spent in the United States. And after being in the U.S. for a while, he wrote a book of reflections on pain with the Christian author Philip Yancey called Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants. And in it, he observed how badly people in the United States deal with suffering. And a quote from him is this. In the United States, he says, a nation whose war for independence was fought in part to guarantee a right to the pursuit of happiness, I encountered a society that seeks to avoid pain at all costs. Patients lived at a greater comfort level than any I had previously treated, but they seemed far less equipped to handle suffering and were far more traumatized by it. Because of our prosperity, because of the way that we are able to minimize suffering, and even because of our beliefs as a culture about the purpose of life and the pursuit of happiness, we are singularly unequipped to deal with suffering. So again, happy July 4th weekend. And this belief, this difficulty of dealing with suffering, extends to many Christians as well. We sometimes see God's primary role in our lives as making us happy and giving us a comfortable life. About 15 or 20 years ago, there's a sociologist named Christian Smith who did a survey of young adults who had grown up in the church and was trying to determine what they really believed about God and about themselves. And he came up with a term to describe what so many of the people that he interviewed believed. This term was called moralistic therapeutic deism. These were people who grew up in the church, were church their whole young lives, and they believed first that they were moralists. They thought that the goal of life was to become a good person, and that if you were a good person, that God would reward you. Therapeutic, the purpose of God was to make you happy and to give you what you wanted. And deism, referring to an 18th century belief that God existed, but he was not actively involved in governing the universe. He had created the universe, but stepped back and was not actively involved in their lives. So moralistic therapeutic deism, at least according to Christian Smith, during his survey 15 or 20 years ago, was for many Christians even in the United States their default way of viewing God and themselves. But that is not a view that they could possibly get from the Bible. Timothy Keller, whose book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, I looked at in preparation for this sermon. He has a great overview of the different ways that we deal with suffering, and he had a great quote about how naive we can be when it comes to suffering. Some people have the naive view that because they're fairly savvy people or self-disciplined or morally decent or good Christians, that really, really bad things simply can't happen to them. And that is nothing but bad theology. And so many people's misery and distress in suffering, when they eventually do encounter suffering, as we all must in this life, it's doubled and trebled, coming not from the trouble itself, but from the shock that they are suffering at all. So Peter says at the beginning of this passage, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that you are going through right now. Suffering can surprise us. It often does surprise us. But Peter says, and the Bible as a whole says, don't be surprised. Suffering can only surprise us when we have what I would call an incomplete view of the world and of God. So, that was the first part of the sermon, why suffering surprises us. And now, what is going on behind our suffering? I'll try to depict a little bit of a fuller picture so that maybe we're less surprised when we're faced with suffering. The first thing that I won't spend too much time on, because it isn't the main burden of the passage, but I want to present it as a possibility, is that we may be suffering as what Peter calls evildoers. He says in verse 15, don't suffer as a murderer or a thief or even a meddler. Sometimes it is true that we suffer because we have done wrong. Sometimes our suffering is the natural results of our actions. And in times when we are faced with suffering, we do have to be honest with ourselves about whether this is a possibility. But it's usually not a good idea. In fact, I'll upgrade that from usually to say never. It is never a good idea to accuse others of this without knowing the full story. To accuse others of wrongdoing and saying that they are suffering because of some evil that they have done. You don't want to be like Job's friends. So that is one possibility of what might be going on when suffering happens. We may be suffering the natural results of our actions. But what I want to spend a little bit more time looking at is the possibility that we may be being tested and refined. This is how Peter opens this passage in verse 12. Don't be surprised by the fiery ordeal that you are suffering right now. And the word that's translated fiery ordeal is porosis, which it almost sounds like the word purify. The trials that come on us, no matter what their source, whether or not we deserve them, can serve to test us and to purify us in a similar way that going through a refining fire tests and removes impurities from metals. There's another quote from Tim Keller on this. The biblical understanding of a furnace is more what we would call a forge. Anything with that degree of heat is, of course, a very dangerous and powerful thing. However, if used properly, it does not destroy. Things put into the furnace properly can be shaped, refined, purified, and even beautified. So that is the main option that Peter is getting at in this passage as far as the source of his readers' sufferings. And it is something that we can learn about a possibility of what's going on in our own sufferings, that it is something that has come upon us, and we have an opportunity to be purified by it if we will not run from it too quickly, if we will allow it to do its work in us. As Paul Brand argued in his book, Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants, pain is not to be avoided necessarily. Pain can be a gift if we allow it to purify us. It takes discernment, though, to know what we should do when we're faced with pain. Some Christians have taken this to mean that they should never go to the doctor and they should never take any medication. And I'm not saying that at all. We should take advantage of the good gifts of modern medicine. But there often comes a point in our suffering, whether it's physical or emotional or otherwise, where we have to discern whether it is something that we should try to minimize or get rid of, or something that we should try to learn from and allow it to help us to grow into more joyful, more good, more Christ-like people. So that is an option of what might be happening to us when we are undergoing suffering. And then another one, which is very similar, that Peter talks about in verses 17 and 18, is that we are being judged. He refers to judgment beginning with the household of God. And there will be a final judgment, which those who have faith in Christ don't have to fear. But even those who are in Christ, I would say, and I think Peter would say, will have to go through a sort of judgment, even in this life. And Peter's saying that this judgment is, in certain circumstances, brought forward into this life for Christians. And over the course of this judgment, we are separated from our idols, those things that we have oriented our lives around, but that will ultimately destroy us if we worship them, if we give our full allegiance to them. For some, the fire of judgment can purify them. It makes us who we were created to be. It can be a furnace that purifies. It makes us joyful and loving and like Jesus, but For others, the fire of judgment, sometimes the same sort of fire, can consume them. It can make them more bitter, more cynical, more despairing. So we are all going to, at some point in life, go through a kind of fire, but it is possible to remain joyful in the midst of suffering and to have it refine us rather than destroy us. So, now third, the possibility of finding joy in suffering. And I approached this part of the sermon with some trepidation. I didn't want to call it how to handle suffering, how to find joy in suffering, because there are many parts of suffering where you are tempted to despair, and I wouldn't want to tell anyone that the way to handle suffering, the way to find joy in suffering is just to plaster on a smile and tell everybody that everything is okay. I don't think that is how to find joy in suffering, is to act as if you are being happy or joyful. I think it goes deeper than that, and it is a difficult thing. So the possibility of finding joy in suffering. Here are some things that I think can make it possible. One, which I talked about a little bit at the beginning of the sermon, is don't be surprised. If we go through life thinking that God owes us a comfortable life, that our entire lives are going to be going up and to the right all the time, with greater and greater prosperity and happiness. If that is our belief about who we are and who God is and what the world is like, then suffering is going to surprise us and overwhelm us. But if we look at Jesus and we see that in spite of his living a perfect life, and in spite of his being God himself, he was, as the prophet Isaiah says, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. If we are able to look at him, look at his life, we are better able to understand that suffering is going to happen to us at some point, and we'll be less surprised and more ready for it, and less overwhelmed by it. So, one possibility for finding joy in suffering is to not be surprised. And the second is, as Peter says in verse 19 of our passage, commit yourself to God and continue to do good. Sometimes when you're suffering, especially if it's a suffering in a relationship, whether it's familial or at work or with a friend, you are going to be misunderstood. You may be condemned unjustly. And part of what Peter is getting at in this last verse of our passage of committing yourself to God, continuing to do good, is that we should entrust ourselves to God who judges justly. That we believe that God is on the throne of the universe, and that even though his reign does not seem evident at the moment, if we are suffering for doing good, for following Jesus the way that we think we should, to believe that God will eventually do what is right by us and by everyone. This commitment enables us to find a measure of joy in suffering. And there are several places in the Bible that I could point to, several stories. An example is the story of Joseph from the Old Testament, who was sold into slavery by his brothers and was in prison for many years, and eventually was vindicated and became second in command in Egypt. But those were long years in prison. A third option or possibility of finding joy in suffering is to meditate on the suffering of Christ, knowing that he is with you. We're not able to escape suffering in this life, but there is a joy in looking at what Jesus suffered on our behalf and thinking that God himself suffered for us, that he wanted to save us, to be with us, to reunite us with himself so badly that he was willing to become human and suffer for us. When it comes to why we face suffering, the issue of the problem of evil, why do bad things happen, this is something that Christianity has that no other religion has. The belief that God himself became human and suffered, so that whenever we are enduring suffering, even if we don't know the cause of it, even if we don't know what the result in the short term will be, we know that God himself has suffered for us and is suffering with us and has not. We will not experience anything that he has not experienced as well. He was weak. He served and was misunderstood by those he served. Everything that we could possibly suffer, Jesus suffered it to the utmost. So, this last quote from Tim Keller, I'll read and then we'll be done. Suffering can refine us rather than destroy us because God himself walks with us in the fire. In Jesus Christ, we see that God actually experiences the pain of the fire as we do. He truly is God with us in love and understanding in our anguish. I don't know about all of you, but in my own life, I have suffered as a wrongdoer, as Peter would put it in this passage. I have suffered the good or natural consequences of things that I've done wrong. And I have suffered as a Christian, as I have suffered for wanting to follow the way of Christ as best as I could. And there is a difference between those two. And I've found that to be true, and many of you have, I'm sure, found that to be true as well, where when I have suffered as a wrongdoer, there is guilt and shame and a tendency to hide, to blame other people or blame circumstances. That kind of suffering, I suffer it much more internally. Whereas in those circumstances where I've gone through suffering and have been trying to stick as closely to Jesus as I could and have been following the way of Jesus as much as I could, even in the face of misunderstandings and hardships, there is a difference. The suffering doesn't go away, but I know that suffering does not ultimately touch me in the deepest part of myself. And I know that it will not last. So, my final encouragement to you is we will suffer at various times in life. And there is a possibility of finding joy in suffering. I would not condemn anybody for not being able to find that in the midst of their suffering. But it is possible when you look to Christ and you see how he has suffered for you, and you see him in the fire with you. So, if you are suffering today, I pray that you will turn to him and recognize that he is with you and that he will wipe away every tear from your eye. And if you're not suffering today, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but just wait. But he will be with you when the time comes. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for your presence among us. You have not promised that you will take away all the suffering from this life, but you have promised us something much greater, which is that you are with us. You are in the fire with us. You endure it with us, and you have endured the hottest parts of it that we could never get through on our behalf. All right, I pray for all those who are suffering today and wondering where you are, that you will give them a sense of your presence and your love, and that you are for them. Amen.